You're listening to Lexington Community Radio, WLXU 93.9, and this is Bike Talk.
Hi, I'm your host, Wanda Bertram. Today we're talking about a bill before the Kentucky State Legislature. This bill regards how to safely overtake bicycles on our roadways. And with us today is Dixie Moore. Hi, Dixie. It's great to have you on the show.
Well, thank you, Wanda. I'm glad to be here.
And Dixie, before we talk about the bill, can you talk about what your role has been in pursuing this bill to make it become a law?
Well, I'm what's called a volunteer advocate, a citizen advocate. And 3 years ago, I saw where it would be really nice if Kentucky had a law that specified that 3 feet was the amount of clearance that one should give, the minimum clearance that one should give when passing a bicycle. And it, surprised me that it wasn't in law. It's recommended, but it's not in law. I'm a recreational cyclist, so this is important to me. So I then proceeded to see if there was support from cycling clubs and other organizations for this type of change, and then I have pursued it for 3 years. But I've only been able to pursue it because cyclists have been behind me, and the role of social media has been crucial in this.
So tell me about this process. 3 years is a long time to pursue anything, especially as a volunteer.
Well, the legislature meets between January and March. So it was like a fourth of 3 years, not the entire 3 years. But I just kept plugging away at it. And people would write me or talk to me and say, hey, this is a good idea. So that type of support kept me going. And most of the cycling clubs have Facebook websites. And so it was very easy to put something out on Facebook. In fact, I have a list of 30 sites. And when I want to communicate, I just make up a post and then I post it on that many sites. And then people can say, yes, this is a good idea. Yes, we'll call the legislators. Keep going, Dixie. This is good.
So you've had a huge community of cyclists and other advocates from across the state behind you on this bill.
That's correct. The YMCA came out, the Association of YMCAs. It's like I would go here in my local community and talk to someone, and then they would tell me how to connect, or they would connect me to the statewide organization. The Kentucky Conservation Group supports it because having more bicycles means having less motorized transportation, possibly less pollution. The health departments support it, or some of them have. And the trail towns, communities in Kentucky that want to attract more tourism have been supportive of it. So I've had different coalitions, so to speak, or different groups that were in support of this bill, and I was able to mobilize them to talk to their legislatures.
And today happens to be a big day for this bill and for all of these advocates.
That is most certainly the case. In the first year, 2016, it passed the Senate, but it never was heard in the House. The next year, it passed the Senate. It had an unfriendly amendment put on it. In other words, something that would have gutted the bill, and it didn't get heard in the House. This year, Representative Jerry Miller started it in the House. It passed the House 73-3, and it was heard in something called the Senate Transportation Committee, which is the committee that says what can go to the Senate. And it passed that. And today at 4:00, if all goes well, it will be voted on by the Senate, and this will be the last big step in becoming law. If it passes today in the Senate, then it would go to the governor to sign, and that would be the only next step. No, excuse me. It has to go back to the House to make sure that the House agrees with it, because there was an amendment that was put on it, which doesn't change the bill, but the House has to approve it.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about what's in that bill and what that sub might incur as well. But first, can you tell people how they can stay in touch with how this is moving through the Senate today?
Well, Kentucky has a very nice service. We have Kentucky Educational TV, and they have something called legislative coverage. So if you go on a KET website, search for legislative coverage, you can find where they will stream the Senate activities today at 4 o'clock. And that's what I will be doing at 4 o'clock.
And then you also are very diligent about keeping people informed otherwise.
Yes, I have a page on Facebook called Safer Passing Law for Kentucky, where I post information as soon as I know it and always give an encouragement to call or talk to your legislator. And then I also post on all the cycling sites.
So all of the Facebook pages, such as the Bluegrass Cycling Club.
Yes, the Laurel County Cycling Club, the Limestone Cycling Club, Western Cyclists, and then most people have given me permission to get onto their pages, but some I just email them. I email somebody in the organization and they will post it for me, like on the Chain Reaction Club down in Paducah. Then there's the Ashland Cycling enthusiasts up in Ashland, and the Cincinnati clubs, because the Cincinnati clubs tend to have Kentucky members and they bike in northern Kentucky as well.
And all of these members have actually been critical and vocal. And can you talk a little bit about the importance of that and how the cycling community has helped you?
One, if I have an idea about how I could support the bill or an argument that I could use, you can sort of put it out there on Facebook or in some emails, because I also have a Google distribution list of about 300 people, people who have shown definite interest in the topic. And so they get distribution emails. And so they can sort of help me think through whether or not this would be a good approach or not. And it does enormous good in keeping me motivated to hear somebody reply, good work, Dixie, keep it up.
Well, and that's helped you develop consensus in the cycling community behind what needed to be in this bill.
Correct. Because some people, a minority, felt that any law that would single out bicycles as being a different type of vehicle would not be good. And this bill does that. It says you should pass a bicycle. You should think differently about passing a bicycle than you would another car, because there are some variables. The difference in size between a car and a bicycle makes it much easier for a large vehicle to pull the bicycle toward them just by the draft that they cause if they're too close. And also, bicycles are usually hurt much more in an accident between cars and bicycles. So with those in mind, I think that this bill is a good bill because it tells people how to pass a bicycle.
And during the legislative process, there was a lot of very vigorous and very, I think, constructive discussion around this issue, the passing issue, as well as other issues as well. And we'll talk about those in our next segment as we talk about what's actually in this bill. But going back to the community of cyclists, how instrumental was their voice in getting this bill moving forward?
This could not have been done without them. I would put out the posts on Facebook and the distribution list. The next day or the day after, when I would make a call to legislators to ask to see them, because I would go down to Frankfort, usually once a week and, basically do cold calls. Okay. I want to talk to Representative so-and-so about the cycling bill. Brief. I'll only take a few minutes. If I had made contact over Facebook with people, I assumed that they had then called in, because then it was easier for me to get an appointment. They literally opened doors for me.
All right. Well, we're going to take a short break, so stay tuned in. We'll be back with Dixie Moore and talk about opening doors. Welcome back to Bike Talk on Lexington Community Radio. I'm your host, Wanda Bertram, and today we're talking about a bill before the Kentucky State Legislature. It goes before the full Senate today at 4:00 for a vote, which is very exciting. We're with Dixie Moore, who for several years has spearheaded this effort to get the bill passed, which regards how to safely overtake bicycles on our roadway. And Dixie, we've talked quite a bit in the last segment about the legislative process and this people in the cycling community who made it possible for the bill to advance, and the legislators. Once the bill has passed, what else can the cycling community do?
Say thank you. Say thank you to the legislators who voted for it and who helped pass it, because they did, I did something, but they did a lot. And your appreciation to them shows the strength of cycling. And so then therefore, the next time around, they might be more willing to listen to cycling concerns and to help them forward on some issue in the future.
Are there any people, any legislators specifically that folks should contact? Say thank you, send a card, a call.
Well, yes. Here in Central Kentucky, I really can't think of one right off the top of my head. I think all of the state senators and the state legislators from Central Kentucky have voted for the bills over the 3-year period. So generally just, thank your local representative and senator. The other person who was most crucial this year was Representative Jerry Miller from Louisville. He did what's called carried the bill. In other words, he introduced the legislation back in before Christmas, I believe. He pre-filed the bill, and then he was the one who sponsored it in the House, who presented it at the House Transportation Committee along with, some other people. But he was the key person in this process to get it through the House, the first time that it has gotten through the House. And later when we talk about the people who were not for the bill, maybe it can become clearer his role. And then the 2 years before, Senator Robin Webb from Ashland carried the bill in the Senate. So she is just as important, because without the prior 2 years experience, we might not have gotten it this year. When I went down to Frankfurt, what people told me was, it usually takes 3 years to get a bill through. In other words, it takes 3 years of people knowing that it's a good bill, to sort of iron out their objections to it, to get people in line for it. And I found that very true, because most of the legislature, now there's some, I would say maybe only about 25%, maybe to 50% of the legislators had any experience of riding a bicycle. So that means that the things that I was bringing up from a cyclist point of view were totally new to 50% of the people I was talking to, which makes for a hard sell.
Yes, it does. So how can people contact the legislators? They can go online, find out who is their legislator, certainly, but how do they call their legislator or send a thank you?
Well, Kentucky has made it very easy. There's an 800 number, 800-372-7181. And this is on the Legislative Research Commission website, commonly called the LRC website. And there also, the emails are given there as well. But they have streamlined the emails for the senators and the legislators to where it's their first name dot last name at lrc.ky.gov. So it's very easy to send off an email to them. It's very easy to write a personal letter and use snail mail and send it to the Capitol Annex in Frankfurt. All that information is given on the LRC website. Another person that was very instrumental was Senator David Givens in the Senate this year. And he's been instrumental all along in helping his fellow senators know about the bill and to reassure them that that there was no unexpected time bombs in it, that it was as it was presented.
And there were also several people in the cycling community that helped you testify as well.
That's true. I think so much is done in one-to-one conversation and committee meetings and behind the scenes in Frankfurt that the real push in a committee is to have people behind you who look interested. And this is where my own club that I belong to, the Bluegrass Cycling Club, came out really strong. I knew that there were people who literally had my back when I was in those committee meetings. And so the senators and the legislators, when they are sitting up in their spaces, they can see that there is this sea of faces that support. It's not so much that a lot of people said something, but that they were there, because that shows a lot of support to take off work, perhaps drive an hour, sit around for an hour and sit there and be seen. There were also cyclists from Louisville and from other parts of Kentucky as well. I just know my own club the best, so I mentioned them.
Yeah, and then there were people that actually stood up at the podium and testified too.
Probably one of the more important ones the most important one was Troy Hearn, who is the bicycle pedestrian coordinator in the Department of Transportation. For the past 3 years, transportation has been supportive of my effort, Bill, but this year they really came out and they said that this is a good bill and it would be good for Kentucky. And Troy was a very competent person to present those views, and that was extremely good. Also, Phil Haranahan, who is a cyclist from Bourbon County, also spoke eloquently on the bill. And also what was very nice, and I did not make this happen at all, but Senator Harris in one of the meetings in the Senate had asked I think he's a major in the state troopers, to testify on the bill. And while he said that the bill would not, if the conditions in the bill had been followed, it probably would not have stopped any of the recent deaths that have occurred. He did say that overall it would make driving and cycling safer in Kentucky. And that was an enormous boost to the bill.
So lots and lots of people behind this that helped you all the way through over the course of 3 years.
Yes, and some of them I didn't even know until they spoke up.
Yeah. So Dixie, let's talk about what is actually in this bill. And you didn't just come up with the language for this bill. You did a lot of research, and there was a precedent for this bill. We're not the first state to have this bill.
No, we're about the 35th. The League of American Cyclists is a national organization for the advancement of safety of cycling, and they have model legislation, which has been based on other states moving in this direction. There are a couple of states that even have a stiffer requirement, 4 to 5 feet, that you have to give clearance of 4 to 5 feet. But it seems that at least having a minimum of 3 feet when you pass has been something that has been adopted. And while it's hard to find, studies in this area, the anecdotal evidence from the other states, from their police departments, from the news reports, is that it has improved the situation.
So lots of you were able to look at the language in laws of many other states and work with the League of American Cyclists to come up with what actually went into this bill.
That's correct.
All right. Well, we're going to take another short break and we'll be right back to talk about this bill, which we hope will be law today. Welcome back to Bike Talk on Lexington Community Radio. Thanks for tuning in. I'm your host, Wanda Bertram. Today we're talking about a bill before the Kentucky State Legislature. It actually goes before the full Senate today. It may become law. It's looking like it. The bill regards how to safely overtake bicycles on our roadways. And with us is citizen advocate Dixie Moore, who for 3 years as a volunteer has spearheaded an effort to get this bill passed. And we've talked about the process of how this bill may become a law today. And we've talked about the volunteers and all the efforts that have gone behind it and the precedent for this bill nationally and in other states. Dixie, can you talk about now, finally, specifically, what's in the bill?
Thank you. The main provision is to give a clearance of at least 3 feet when passing a bicycle. If there is also an adjacent lane, either a lane coming toward you or a lane going in the same direction as you are, that you are to use the adjacent lane to pass the bicycle. Then there is a third element, which gives motorists the legal right to go over the yellow line to pass a bicycle if there is no oncoming traffic and if there is good line of sight. And why this one? And this also is in other states. I mean, this is not just new in Kentucky at all. First of all, as a cyclist, I know that this is what motorists do. They pass me all the time going across the yellow line. Because a bicycle, particularly a single biker, single cyclist on the side, there's good vision. Also, the cyclist is going so much slower in comparison to the car that the car can pass the cyclist a lot quicker. In studying this, I found that the laws about no passing zones were made to accommodate cars passing other cars at slightly below the speed limit. In other words, those zones were set up to make it safe for a car going, say, 55 to pass a car going 50. But now the situation with a bicyclist is that usually a car is going 55, passing a bicyclist that's going maybe 15 miles an hour. So it's much safer and quicker to get around the bicyclist than to stay behind. And so that is why that is included in the law.
So safer for cyclists and safer for cars altogether.
Both, because, one of the things that causes the most irritation, I think, with motorists is that they feel that the cyclists are clogging up the roads. And so if we can help a motorist get around us, then we save road rage.
So it seems that some of this is kind of obvious. This seems like it's the practice anyway.
Yes, but I consider myself a law-abiding citizen. So, there's always a sort of a cringe, it's like, am I really doing the right thing? And so I think to spell it out that under certain situations, it is acceptable to pass over a yellow line is very good practice.
So this makes it legal for motorists to cross over the yellow line when passing a bicycle. Before it wasn't legal.
Correct.
So that is very important, and also protecting the motorist.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about some of the statistics that drove this bill as well? Why this is so important?
Well, over the last several years, generally we have somewhere between 6 and 8 cyclists die a year on the roads in Kentucky. And the number of cyclists comparatively is small compared to the number of motorists. And by the way, most cyclists also drive cars.
Right.
And so that seemed to be unacceptable. Nationally, it's like 1% of the deaths that occur there are twice as many deaths from bicycles, people who are riding bikes, than would be expected from cars, given the number of people that drive cars and the number of people that bike. So it's a much higher percentage, and this seemed to be unacceptable. I think there was a recent study where they talked about that about 4,600 cyclists were reported injured in vehicle collisions between, looks like, the last 10 years. And so that's a lot of people hurt.
Well, and part of the argument, too, for this bill was economic.
Both economics and education. As the major said in the testimony that he gave, he didn't think that if this bill was followed, that it would have prevented those particular 7 deaths in the last year. But having a defined standard of how to pass a cyclist gives us a platform for education. And so I think the more education we have about how to do it, that is where the safety is going to come from.
Yes, and within the legislative process, there was a lot of discussion about education versus enforcement.
Yes. And I want to go back to something that you mentioned. You talked about the economic impact. Again, trail towns. I think there's maybe 15 trail towns. Usually they're often in eastern Kentucky. And they're trying to get more tourism to make up for the many job losses there. And cycling tourism is growing and can be possibly a niche industry. And having this type of law helps attract cyclists. As one legislator said, often, I don't want people to have a false assurance of security with this law. And as a cyclist, we are not going to have a false assurance of security. But it does mean something to know that the state that I'm riding in at least is trying to educate people on how to safely pass me.
And tourism organizations, don't they use particular standards and rate states on cycling safety in states they recommend to cycle in.
Yes, and it's not necessarily a tourist organization, but the League of American Cyclists every year puts out ratings on how states do in terms of cycling safety and promoting cycling. And in terms of being a bike-friendly state, Kentucky was 49th about 3 years ago. We moved up a little bit because there is more money being spent on infrastructure, and infrastructure means trails, bike lanes, the green signs on the roadways. But we spend more money on biking now. But in terms of our legal framework that we have set up, we were still 49th. And so this is going to raise us in those standards. And, if I'm going to look to take a vacation and take my bike somewhere, and if two places are equally attractive to me and what I see and the quality of where I will ride, this might make a difference.
And can you talk a little bit about the enforcement aspect as well? Because there was a lot of discussion around how enforceable is this law, and is that the intent, truly?
Technically, it can be enforced. It probably won't be because it'll be low priority for our policemen who have other things that they feel are more important and probably should feel more important. I mean, it's like a texting law. How many people are stopped because they're texting when they're driving? But it becomes important if there's an accident. Then they can reconstruct if somebody was texting, and this might lead to people reconstructing if someone gave 3 feet. But on the other side, all other laws pertaining to cycling are still in place. And a major law in Kentucky, as it is in many other states, is that a bicycle is considered a slow-moving vehicle. And as a slow-moving vehicle, bicycles are to keep as closely to the right as practical. So let's say there is a collision, an accident. So someone's going to say, hey, the cyclist wasn't as far right as they should be. And now the cyclist can say, yeah, maybe that's true, but also I wasn't given 3 feet clearance.
All right. Well, we're going to take another short break because it's that time. And we'll be back with you in a few moments to talk more about the impact of this bill as it may become law today. Welcome back to Bike Talk on Lexington Community Radio. I'm your host, Wanda Bertram. Today with us is Dixie Moore, who for 3 years has spearheaded an effort to get a bill passed for safer cycling. Bill regards how to safely overtake bicycles on our roadways. We've been talking about the impact of this bill. And Dixie, can you talk a little bit more about the fiscal impact?
Very, very little. Basically, it means rewriting some of the driver's manual and the educational materials that come out of the Department of Transportation, which are redone, periodically. But I think it was seen as having almost zero fiscal impact, which is important given the state of the finances of our state right now.
And that's actually helps bills to get passed if they have a very low fiscal impact.
Yes, most definitely.
Well, and in this process, there were other issues that came up. You really pressed for this to be a clean bill, meaning that nothing else was attached to it in content. But along the way, there have been multiple efforts to attach other content and other issues to this bill.
Yes. As one legislator told me, I'm for your bill as long as it doesn't have a lead balloon on it. And one of the first issues that was brought up was that we should make it a law to have lights on bikes during the daytime, similar to how cars often are equipped with what are called running lights, I think. And, as a recreational cyclist, I also do errands and use cycling for transportation, but I'm also out on the roads as a recreational cyclist. I have started to and try to routinely use a light on the back of my bike. So here I think it's a good idea. So why wouldn't I think that it wouldn't be good law? Well, there are many bikes. Does this mean that the 10-year-old boy on a bike in a neighborhood should have a light on his bike? And why is a light important? A light is to make you more visible. Well, current Kentucky law, which is in the Kentucky Administrative Regs, says that you have to have a light on your bike at night that can be seen for 500 feet. And between the hours of 1/2 hour before before sunrise, and 1/2 hour after sunset. And those are the times where it is dim. It's not dark, but it's dim. And those conditions can occur during the daytime in the summer on a road that is heavily covered with a tree canopy because no light gets through. And I think one of the things that this whole issue has brought out for me this year is how we aren't following the current law of using our lights the way we should be in low visibility situations. So I don't see the need to say that you have to have a light on all the time during the day, because, if I'm wearing yellow, I think the back of me dressed in yellow with yellow socks is as good as a light if I'm in sunlight. So I think this would have been an unnecessary addition to the bill, which if passed would have caused more problems for the attorneys and the lawyers and enforcement and the cyclists. And also it was put on, I think, it was suggested with good intention, but if a law does not have the backing of cyclists, then as people, we would tend maybe not to want to shrug our, nose at all laws. And so I'm sure this is going to be a topic that's going to be discussed among cyclists as to whether or not it should be a requirement. It often is a good practice, but a good practice doesn't necessarily mean that it would make a good law.
Yes, and as the legislature, the Senate debated that, there were several points that were brought up. One was that there had been no research on this topic to see what kind of light standardization and lumens would be necessary for a light in the daytime to be visible. That same light could blind drivers at night, the same light. And the idea of economics, that it basically discriminated against low-income people, creating a barrier to get into biking as well, that it really enhanced the cost. And for community cycling shops like the Broke Spoke, who would have to be responsible then to make sure that the bikes that they put out into the communities had the appropriate lights on them. Again, creating a barrier for low-income bike shops.
You said it quite well. Right now, bicycles are supposed to have reflectors on them, and no bike is sold without them. And so it would have been, more of a hardship to have a light on every bike that is sold, or for the cyclist to be responsible to have a light on a bike.
Well, the other issue that came up, the other, attempt to attach something to the bill, we call it 2x2 versus singling up.
Mm-hmm. Yes, there was an attempt to have an amendment that said that you should ride single file in, I think that was said, in areas where the speed limit was over 35. In other words, cyclists could not ride side by side. Current law says that we have the option, but even if we're riding side by side, we should not interfere with the normal flow of traffic. Again, it's a situational call, and not to have the ability to ride side by side, I think, would be more dangerous than to say that you always have to be in single file. Now, generally, when there's cars behind you, responsible cyclists do what they call single up. But if there are a group of cyclists and there's a lot of cars and there's a clear passing area, it's easier for cars to pass a group of cyclists than one because the distance is shorter. Also, and I thought this was interesting, of all the fatalities that occur, they occur for single cyclists, not for cyclists riding side by side. In other words, cyclists are more visible if there is the mass of two versus one. Also, we have hilly roads, and a cyclist at the top of a hill can see over and maybe can see someone coming. And so a maneuver that is done by responsible cyclists is that if they see somebody behind them and they think they're about ready to pass them, they will move over, perhaps ride side by side, or, as we would say, quote, take the lane, to keep the person from passing because they can see the oncoming car that the motorist cannot.
So I think where the discussion landed, and this idea was not attached as an amendment, was that we need to educate cyclists and drivers about the existing law and to use and obey that existing law, which takes us back to this bill that we hope will become law today as it passes the Senate, that one of the primary important components of this new law is education. So, Dixie, what can we expect in the coming months, anticipating that we will have this new law?
First, I want to say I read a study that said that 85% or something near 85% of motorists are law abiding, and that 85% of cyclists are as well. So if we can get the information out about what is the current law, both in terms of lights, both in terms of riding side by side, and also on how to pass, then I think we go a long way in improving the safety of our roads. And how would this happen? One, I think we would see, the section in the driver's manual that talks about bicycles, because the driver's manual not only talks about how to drive a car, it talks about how to drive a motorcycle and how to drive a bicycle, and also how to interact with these different vehicles on the road. So that would be rewritten. What I would hope is that there would be a bicycling question on the driver's test, because then that brings it up in people who are learning to drive that, hey, I've got to be concerned and know about this. I think one of the interesting studies is that the more cyclists there are on the roads, the safer the roads tend to be, because we're sort of like a traveling sign that says, be aware, and that helps.
And what is going to be coming up aside from new drivers for existing drivers, education? Is there something clubs can do? Are there grants out there that communities can access so that they can help with this educational process?
Well, you probably have seen the license plates that have the cyclist on them, the share the road license plates. Well, they bring in, I think, about $80,000 a year. I think I'm correct on that, but it's a sizable sum. Let's just say it's a sizable sum. And that is given out into grants. And these grants can be applied by communities and cycling organizations for anything that would improve cycling. So I would see a lot of these grant monies going to local organizations to try to educate cyclists and motorists on how to safely interact.
And communities can apply for those grants as well.
That's true, through the Department of Transportation. And then there are federal grants that the Kentucky Department of Transportation, I think, can apply for, that are based for education.
And municipalities can have a role in informing their citizens too.
Yes. My idea would be is that when you went into a place to get your license renewed, you would see some sort of sign on the wall, sort of summarizing some of these points that we've talked about today.
Well, Dixie, thanks so much. It's been great talking to you again.
Thank you very much.
And we'll be watching and listening diligently this afternoon at 4:00.
Yes. And if the bill passes today, then goes to the governor to be signed, which I hope that he would do. And then 90 days after the close of the legislature is when it would be officially become law. But we talk about it becoming law if it passes the Senate, just because that is so important.
Everyone, make sure to thank your legislator.
That's exactly right.
All right. Well, don't forget to tune in to Bike Talk at the same time next week for all things cycling, helping you get out, explore our towns and countryside in Lexington and beyond. Thanks for joining us. Be safe and enjoy the ride.